Republican credo can be summed up this way: help the rich, hurt the middle class. The whole year can be summed up in that one sentence. Republicans have spent every waking hour catering to the wealthy and special interests, leaving the middle class and those struggling to get there as an afterthought. In doing so, the Republicans have cemented their legacy as the party of the rich. If you ask the top 1% how Senate Republicans did this year, they'd give them an A. If you ask the wealthy and powerful corporations how Republican senators did this year, they'd give them an A. If you ask the wealthy Americans who have taken advantage of tax loopholes how they did this year, they'd give the Republican senators an A. But if you ask middle-class Americans how the Republican Senate did this year, they'd give them a big, fat, red F. This week crystallizes this year in the Senate perhaps better than any other. In the same week that Senate Republicans lower the top tax rate on the wealthiest of Americans, they're failing to reauthorize the CHIP program that provides health care for millions of sick kids. In the same week that Senate Republicans voted to slash corporate taxes, they're shortchanging millions of middle-class Americans who lost their homes to wildfires and historic storms. In the same week that they're preserving the carried interest loophole they said they'd close, Republicans are failing to provide a boost in funding of both military and key domestic programs that the middle class relies on, like infrastructure, funding to combat the opioid crisis, pension relief, and more. They have been so focused, our Republican colleagues have, on taxes, they've been unwilling to reach agreement on these issues for fear it would upset their tax deal. That's been the story of the year. For the last 3 months, Republicans have buried their heads in their tax bill, zealously slashing taxes for those who need it the least, while leaving the critical middle-class programs behind. That's been the story of this year. Republicans haven't accomplished much, but what they have accomplished has only benefited the wealthy and well-connected. Reminds me of the old Woody Allen scene. Woody's at the diner with someone, and this guy says to him, "You know, these portions are small." No, sorry, I got it backwards. The guy says to him, "This food is terrible." But Woody said, "Yeah, but the portions are small." Yeah. Well, they haven't, the Republicans haven't accomplished much, but what they've accomplished has benefited the wealthy and well-connected. Republicans will argue they had a great year, pointing to 3 things: Judge Gorsuch, their use of the Congressional Review Act to roll back regulations, and their tax bill. All 3 of those things will help the rich and powerful. They'll help corporations, but they won't help the middle class. Senate Republicans jammed through Congressional Review Act bills that rolled back protections for middle-class people, for workers, for students, for women, all the while helping special interests. Senate Republicans engaged in historic obstruction to keep a Supreme Court open so that the Heritage Foundation and Federalist Society could handpick a judge that would rule on the side of corporations instead of people. And they capped the year by passing a tax bill that provides huge tax breaks for the rich and the biggest corporations, while providing crumbs and even tax hikes for the middle class. And that's what they did do. We haven't even gotten to what they failed to do or forgot to do. They tried for months to repeal the Affordable Care Act, which would have sent costs soaring for millions of Americans and caused millions more to lose coverage. They failed in that effort, but they have consistently undermined ACA in every way they can think of. Now, when premiums go up, the American people will know that President Trump and Republicans are to blame. They failed to authorize the CHIP program, children's health insurance. They failed to rebuild our infrastructure, something that would create millions of good-paying jobs, despite the president's promise. Wages have barely budged, and our Republican friends haven't done a thing to actually lift those wages. The president talks about the stock market, That helps mainly the rich. Wages, wage earners, growth is nearly flat. The president and Republicans promised they'd stop outsourcing, but that hasn't happened. Even the companies the president said he'd personally work with have sent jobs to Mexico, leaving families in the Midwest and across the country without the income they need this holiday season. Time and time again, the middle class was an afterthought or outright forgotten by Senate Republicans and President Trump. President Trump promised to remember the forgotten man. The forgotten man is still waiting to be remembered. Now, our Republican friends will claim they couldn't achieve more because of obstructionist Democrats, but that isn't true at all. All year long, Republicans have been hell-bent on pursuing a partisan agenda. Right out of the gate, on their two biggest priorities, taxes and health care, they used reconciliation, a partisan process that said Democrats get lost. They didn't even pretend they were being bipartisan. Their view of bipartisanship has been to write the bill themselves, introduce it, and demand Democrats support it. And this year in the Senate, not a single bill at the 60-vote threshold has failed because of a Democratic filibuster. Let me say it again. Before Republicans blame, quote, obstructionist Democrats in the Senate for their lack of accomplishments, they should remember that the Senate Democrats did not filibuster a single bill at the 60-vote threshold. Now, we hope the future will be different. We hope they'll give up on their partisan agenda that leaves behind the middle class and those struggling to get there. But if they don't, the political problems they're having now are only going to get worse. People are standing up and rejecting the Republican agenda across the country, including in states that have been ruby red for years. In Alabama, Virginia, New Jersey, last week in Tennessee, we're seeing an incredible swing away from the Republicans and toward the Democrats, from one end of the country to the other. If Republicans continue to hurt the middle class, if they continue to kowtow to the powerful corporations and the wealthy, then they're in for a reckoning next November. Senator Durbin. Yes.
Do you support the idea of repealing the GOP tax reform bill? And if Democrats were to take the majority in 2018, would you bring up a bill that would repeal the GOP tax reform?
There are probably a small number of provisions we might not repeal, but it certainly would need drastic overhaul, aiming it at the middle class, not at the wealthy and powerful.
Senator, how would you rate the Democrats' year? I mean, so much of this year was Democrats able to stop so many Republican efforts, but now in the last week, whether it's ANWR, whether it's the mandate, they've gotten a lot of things that you have grave concerns around.
Well, let me just say this. First, we've been able to when Donald Trump swept into office with a Republican House and Senate, they thought they'd get huge amounts of things done. The only major thing they can point to is the tax bill. And even on that bill, the public doesn't like it. Why? Because we Democrats have been relentless in letting people know what's really in the bill, and I believe it will be an anchor around the ankles of every Republican who voted for it or who supports it. So we're in the minority. We can't control the agenda. We had wished for bipartisanship, but given the situation we've been in, I think we've had a very, very successful year. And the way to look at it is all the bad things we stopped them from doing, and more importantly, or just as importantly, the public knows how bad they are. You've seen it, and that's part of our job in the minority. Yes?
Now that the tax bill is in place, can you talk a little bit about the impact on the SALT-dependent states?
Yeah, look,
and you know, the
suburbs.
Schumer
this is,
paradigm of the cop married to the nurse, and
yes,
also
yes.
DACA, if you could talk about
Well, in terms of the state and local deductibility, this bill, the tax bill, is the most anti-suburban tax bill that we've seen in a very long time, because suburb after suburb has people who depend on that state and local deductibility. They tend to be Republican suburbs, whether they're the suburbs of Seattle or the suburbs of Detroit or the suburbs of Chicago or the suburbs of New York. And so I think it's a very bad move for them in terms of the substance of America, because we prize our suburbs, and in terms of the politics of America. Yeah, we're not going to address any of those things until we see what the House is going to do. Okay? Yes.
Senator, you talked about bipartisanship. I'm wondering, given how this year has gone, what is your assessment of whether you can find any area of bipartisan cooperation with the
Look, we have
Republicans?
tried over and over again. Even in the tax bill at the late hour, 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans sat down and came up with a much better plan. And immediately the Republican leadership pulled the Republicans away from it. They said, and there's an article today that plots this out, I don't know if it's in which of the major newspapers, in the Washington Post, that the Republican leadership, some people said, let's work with the Democrats. And the leadership said no. Why? The hard right has such a pull on the Republican Party that any form of compromise that does things in the middle splits their party. So politically, it's a disaster for them. Substantively, it's a disaster for the American people.
So do you see any area where you can?
Well, look, as Debbie said, a year ago, we put infrastructure on the president's desk. Now, he's been all over the lot. Some days he said public-private partnerships, and other days he said he realizes public-private partnerships don't work. We had hoped that some of the money for bringing money back from jobs overseas would go into infrastructure. They used it all to reduce taxes on the wealthiest corporations. So hope springs eternal, but they'd have to be a real reversal from the way they've operated now. And why have they operated that way? Because the hard right has just inordinate power in the Republican Party and scares their leadership, scares their membership, and pulls them in the direction that they're only helping the wealthy, the powerful corporations, not the middle class. I mean, if they head in a direction, as they seem to be, to cut Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, every Democrat will be united in fighting them tooth and nail.
Senator Schumer?
Yes.
Senator Schumer, all of you voted for the PIGO law in 2010.
Yeah, as I said, we're not talking about that issue until the we're not talking about that issue until we see what the House does.
Senator Schumer, thank you. One of the things that I didn't hear on your list was the failure to provide a long-term budget for still doing continuing resolution.
Well, we mentioned all the things that they haven't done because they're so busy on the taxes.
At 2018, what do you think it'll take to get a long-term?
Again, we're waiting to see what the House does. We're not commenting on that right now. Let's see what they do.
Can I get your reaction to Leader McConnell's statement on his commitment to Senator Flake that he will put a bipartisan immigration bill on the floor if this group reaches a deal?
Well, we hope we'll see that, but our view is the best place to get this done. If he can put something on the floor and the House will put something on the floor and the President will sign it and it's a good proposal, great. But our view is the best place to get this done will be as part of the CAPS deal and the omnibus, and that's what we're going to be fighting for. Thank you, everybody.
Can you actually point out which parts of the tax bill you would repeal?
No.
Which